I had just stepped out of my final chemo session, me hands still trembling from the medication, when my phone rang. It was a call from the executive office of the company where I had dedicated more than 2 decades of my life. They asked me to come in immediately, without giving a reason. Still dazed, I threw on a jacket and drove to the headquarters of Carson Myers Logistics, an old freight and distribution company in Illinois, where I had served as regional director for the Midwest for nearly a third of my life. I never imagined that day would change everything. When I walked into the boardroom, Charlesty, newly appointed executive vice president, and the CEO Son barely looked up from his stack of papers. His tone was cold, detached. "Mr. Victor, we've reviewed your recent performance. Given your current health condition, I don't believe you're suited for a leadership position anymore." He paused, letting the words sink in before delivering the blow. "You have two choices: stake a demotion or leave." I stood there, my heart pounding not from illness, but from disbelief. Just 6 months ago, I had led the company through the most complex restructuring project in its history. And now, after surviving stage 3 cancer, they were telling me I no longer had value, as if everything I had given, the late nights, the broken holidays, the sacrifices, had evaporated with the chemo drip. I didn't respond. Not because I had nothing to say, but because a more painful truth hit me. In Charles's eyes, I was no longer the man who carried this company through crisis. I was just another worn-out asset, outdated and replaceable. I walked out of that room with a quiet but resolute decision. If they thought I was finished, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Looking back, I realized I never treated my career as just a way to make a living. It was my anchor, my pride, and for many years, the only thing that made sense in a world that kept changing around me. When I joined Carson Myers Logistics back in the late 90s, the company was a modest operation moving farm equipment and factory parts across the Midwest. I started in the loading docks, worked my way into dispatch, and by the time I was 40, I was managing regional operations across 5 states. I never asked for shortcuts, and I never cut corners. Every promotion, every responsibility, I earned by putting in the hours, staying late, and showing up when no one else did. I didn't come from much. My father worked maintenance for a school district. My mother cleaned houses, and maybe that's why I never took anything for granted. While others treated work as a stepping stone, I treated it like a calling. I believed that loyalty would be returned with loyalty, that if you carried a company on your back, the company would have your back when it mattered most. But I was wrong. The first signs of trouble came not from the workplace, but from my body. It started with fatigue I couldn't shake, then night sweats, and sudden weight loss. At first, I blamed the stress, the endless travel, the skipped meals, but when the test came back, the diagnosis hit like a freight train: stage 3 lymphoma. The kind that doesn't whisper, only roars. I told no one at first, not even my wife. I wanted to finish the quarter's targets, close the client contracts I'd been chasing for months, and only then, when everything was stable, would I allow myself to step back and face what was happening. But cancer doesn't wait for your schedule. The treatments began, and so did the struggle to keep up appearances. I'd show up to meetings wearing a smile while hiding the nausea behind closed doors. My staff didn't notice at first, or maybe they pretended not to, but eventually, the weight loss and the slower pace gave me away. It was during this time that Charles appeared. He was brought in quietly as a strategic consultant, but everyone knew what that meant. His father, Richard Carsont, man who once told me I was the backbone of this company, had handed his only son a seat at the executive table. Charles was young, sharp-suited, well-spoken, but completely unfamiliar with the grit it took to keep operations running day after day. Still, I welcomed him. I trained him. I even defended his missteps, thinking time and experience would turn him into a leader. I was naive. As my health declined, Charles began attending more meetings in my place. He'd smile and say it was to lighten my load, but it became clear he was building alliances, whispering about how the company needed fresh energy, how it was time to look toward the future. I was no fool. I had worked too many years to not recognize the slow erosion of trust, the sideways glances, the growing silence when I entered a room. My seat at the table was being replaced while I was still sitting in it. The final blow came not from a boardroom decision, but from an offhand comment that I overheard in the hallway one afternoon after chemo. Charles, speaking with another junior executive, laughed and said, "My dad has this old habit of hiring loyal dogs. They bark well, but don't run anymore." He didn't know I was standing just around the corner, holding the quarterly report he had asked for. I went home that night and stared at my reflection, the man in the mirror looking 20 years older than the one who had first walked into Carson Myers. The betrayal didn't come from strangers, it came from those I had mentored, trained, and defended. That pain was deeper than the illness itself. Still, I kept going, because giving up had never been an option, not when I was 16 bussing tables, not when my first daughter was born while I was working night shifts, and certainly not now. I told myself if I could beat cancer, I could beat corporate betrayal too. But inside, something had shifted. I began to see the truth. In a world obsessed with speed, youth, and appearances, a man with scarce 7 honorable ones was easy to cast aside. That realization didn't break me. It awakened me. I knew then that if I ever wanted to reclaim my worth, it wouldn't come from waiting to be valued. I would have to take it back on my own terms, in my own time, and with a resolve stronger than anything they had ever seen. After that hallway conversation, something in the air around me shifted. It was subtle. At first, meetings I once led were now postponed or held without me. Emails I sent received delayed responses, and people who used to stop by my office now walked past with hurried excuses or eyes fixed on the floor. I wanted to believe it was just paranoia, a side effect of exhaustion, but deep down, I knew what it was. The slow freeze of isolation, engineered carefully and quietly. Charles never confronted me directly, and that was perhaps the most chilling part. Instead, he built a wall around me, brick by invisible brick, all while maintaining a friendly smile in public. He would offer to cover for me in executive calls, claiming I needed rest. He encouraged my staff to take initiative, but began funneling their reports directly to himself. And during company-wide updates, he referred to me less and less, as if I had already been phased out. It was death by 1,000 cut sand. Each cut was delivered with polite precision. Then came the small sabotage. A client meeting I had confirmed weeks earlier was suddenly rescheduled without notice. Product samples I had requested for an important proposal arrived late or, in some cases, not at all. Promotional materials vanished mysteriously, only to be found again after the deadline had passed. At first, I blamed miscommunication, system errors, or just plain bad luck, but the frequency and timing of these mishaps told another story, one I could no longer ignore. The final straw came on a Monday morning when I walked into a negotiation prep session and found our hotel conference room had been canceled. The coordinator, confused and apologetic, told me someone from our own company had called the day before to shut it down. Only a handful of people even knew about the reservation, and only one of them had the motive to see it fall apart. I didn't need a smoking gun, just logic and pattern recognition. Still, I kept quiet. I didn't run to human resources or the president, Richard Carson, because I had learned over the years that true sabotage often wears a suit and speaks in corporate jargon. Instead, I gathered evidence, documented patterns, and spoke to the few colleagues I still trusted in confidence. Most were younger professionals who had no power but plenty of insight. They too had begun to notice a trend. Initiatives led by anyone over 45 were being slowly sidelined, while Charles painted himself as the champion of next-gen innovation, masking his insecurity behind buzzwords and boardroom charm. I tried to stay focused, pouring myself into the upcoming negotiations with Eastridge Petrochem, one of the biggest deals our department had ever landed. I worked late, reviewed every clause, double-checked translations, and rehearsed scenarios with my team, even as the quiet resistance from Charles's loyalists made progress harder with each passing day. And yet, what cut the deepest wasn't Charles's ambition or his manipulation set, was the silence. Not a single executive, not even those I had mentored years ago, stepped in to ask why I was being frozen out. They all saw it. They heard the tension. They knew the contracts I prepared were being rerouted and that my decisions were questioned more than anyone else's. But they said nothing. That silence made me feel smaller than any illness ever had. Cancer had attacked my body, but corporate betrayal was something else entirely. It attacked my dignity, my history, my identity. I had spent years building this house, brick by brick, and now I was being slowly erased from it, as if my fingerprints had never touched its foundation. There was one person who seemed to notice, Amanda, a young analyst in our pricing department, once pulled me aside after a meeting and said, "You know, they're afraid of you, mister. Victor, not because you're failing, but because you never did." That sentence stuck with me. It reminded me that jealousy rarely comes for the weak. It always targets the consistent, the steady, and the unshakable. And so, I stayed my course, choosing to fight in silence and prepare for whatever Charles would throw at me next. Because deep down, I knew the storm hadn't reached its peak. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about the kind of workplace we were becoming. And whether anyone with scars, with years, or with stories like mine would ever be allowed to matter again. There's a certain silence that settles in after betrayal, not the kind that screams or slams doors, but the heavy, hollow, quiet that comes when your purpose has been stripped away. After Charles's subtle campaign to erase me had nearly succeeded, and after the cancer had left my body but weakened everything else, I did something that, at the time, felt like defeat. I left. I submitted my resignation on a gray Thursday morning, not out of weakness, but because I knew I couldn't continue pouring myself into a place that had already decided I was obsolete. I told no one, packed my things slowly, and as I stepped out of Carson Myers for what I thought was the last time, I left behind 2 decades of leadership, mentorship, and sacrifice buried beneath politics, fear, and ambition. The months that followed were some of the loneliest I've ever lived. Chemotherapy had taken a toll on my body, but unemployment, at my age and in my condition, weighed heavier on my spirit. I would wake up each morning to an empty calendar, flip through old project files just to remember the man I used to be, and sit in silence, wondering how quickly society had decided I was no longer worth listening to. But one morning, while sipping lukewarm coffee on the porch of my Indiana home, an email appeared that changed everything. It was from a company called Grayfield Global, a mid-sized trading firm based in Denver. I remembered the name. They had once been a client, impressed by how I handled a cross-border logistics deal years ago. The sender was a man named Alan Weber, the newly appointed vice president, and his message was simple. "I heard you're no longer with Carson Myers. I'd like to talk." At first, I hesitated. Part of me questioned whether I still had anything to offer, whether my voice still carried weight in a room full of younger, faster, louder men. But something deeper reminded me of who I used to be, not just the manager, but the fighter who had endured chemo on Tuesday and shown up for negotiations on Wednesday, the mentor who had taught a generation of account executives how to lead with both strategy and heart. So I replied, and within a week, I found myself seated across from Alan in a quiet Denver office, sunlight casting long lines across the table as he looked me in the eye and said, "I don't want you for a junior role. Our sales director is retiring, and I need someone with a spine and scars. Someone who knows how to walk into a storm and bring calm." That offer felt less like a job opportunity and more like vindication. Joining Grayfield was like entering a different world. The energy was fast-paced, the staff noticeably younger, but the culture was open, collaborative, and refreshingly free of the silent hierarchies I had come to loathe. I took the time to listen, to learn the nuances of the company's internal dynamics, and to earn respect not through titles, but by solving problems others didn't even know existed. But peace never lasts long when you've been wronged and your name still lingers on the lips of those who tried to erase you. A few weeks into my new role, I learned that Grayfield had begun exploratory talks with a major Middle Eastern firm, Khalifa Petrochem, the same group I had helped Carson Myers court in the past, and whose cultural, legal, and linguistic complexities had often scared off even the boldest negotiators. I knew the ins and outs of those partnerships better than anyone, having studied their procurement styles, negotiation, rhythms, and even the regional dialects used in formal discussion. Naturally, I offered to support the preparation phase. Alan agreed, and within days, I was back in familiar territory scrutinizing contracts, leading briefings, and walking the team through cross-cultural etiquette and risk assessment. What surprised me wasn't that I still had the skill, but how quickly the fire returned once I had purpose again. Then, just days before the preliminary meetings were to begin, news came in. Carson, Myers, led by Charles, had also thrown their hat back into the ring, hoping to win the Khalifa deal outright. My stomach turned, not out of fear, but out of something deeper resolve. Charles had always assumed that removing me from Carson Myers was the final move, but he never realized that some people grow stronger in exile, that hardship forges clarity, and that nothing sharpens experience like injustice. I didn't tell anyone at Grayfield about my personal history with the man now leading our rival bid. I didn't need to. All I needed was the contract in front of me, the team beside me, and the quiet assurance that this time no one would take credit for what I had built. So I worked, I stayed late, trained the staff, translated the contract nuances word by word, and prepared our offer to not only compete, but to win. Because I hadn't come this far just to come this far. The final day of negotiations was set to take place in Houston, where a neutral venue had been selected to accommodate the Khalifa delegation. Our team from Grayfield had arrived early, armed with documentation, fluency, and strategy, every piece of the puzzle meticulously placed. I had personally overseen the final translation of the contract, ensuring that every clause honored both legal clarity and cultural respect. What I hadn't anticipated, however, was the message that would come just hours before the meeting began. It was from Charles. His voice cracked through my phone with a frantic urgency I hadn't heard since the days he was still pretending to be respectful. "Victor," he said, breathless, "we need you. They sent over the final contract, and it's entirely in Arabic." For a moment, I said nothing. Not because I didn't have a response, but because I was weighing whether he truly understood the irony of what he'd just said. The same man who had dismissed me, stripped me of purpose, and cast me aside under the guise of progress was now crumbling under the very reality he had refused to acknowledge. I cleared my throat. "You do realize this could have been avoided, Charles, had you bothered to actually read the briefings or kept the person who wrote them." His silence was damning, and in that silence I found something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. He stammered something about miscommunication, about not knowing the language barrier would be an issue, and about the stakes being higher than anticipated. I listened, not out of sympathy, but because I wanted to remember how it felt to hear someone choke on their own arrogance. "We just need someone fluent," he pleaded. "Someone who understands the culture, the phrasing, the expectations." I leaned back in my chair, watching the Houston skyline through the window, and said with quiet resolve, "You had that someone. You fired him." Then I hung up. Later that morning, as expected, the Khalifa team arrived precisely on time. Charles, visibly shaken, tried to delay with scripted pleasantries, but their lead negotiator was unimpressed. He had met me years before and asked directly, in Arabic, whether I would be present. Charles froze. He could barely pronounce my name, let alone understand the question. By that point, Alamy Current VFAD anticipated the possibility that Charles might sabotage the process or stumble over his own ego. He had already arranged a suite one floor above, just in case. I was there, waiting, listening, watching the feed, discreetly provided by our technical team. When the moment came and the deal began to unravel, Alan gave the signal. I stepped into the room. The air shifted the moment I walked in. Eyes turned. The Khalifa lead smiled. Charles blanched. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I spoke not as someone seeking validation, but as the only person in that room who could bridge the gap between two worlds. I began in Arabic, not as a performance, but as a professional fluent in culture, nuance, and diplomacy. Within minutes, the tone shifted. Where there had been uncertainty, there was now trust. Where awkward pauses once loomed, laughter began to fill the room. I made subtle jokes about cultural timing, referenced shared industry headaches, and recalibrated every clause of the contract with precision honed over years of real experience. Charles sat in the corner like a child left behind at a grown-up table, silent, pale, and sweating. The Khalifa team signed. The deal was closed. Grayfield had secured the most competitive contract of the fiscal year, and I had, without raising my voice or lowering my dignity, made it clear that I hadn't been outmatched. I had only been underestimated. What followed was inevitable. Richard Carson, the CEO of my former company, arrived that evening to review what had happened. When he learned that Charles had fired me, fumbled the documentation, and nearly tanked a deal worth millions, he didn't raise his voice, but the disappointment in his tone cut deeper than any reprimand. "You were handed the baton," he told Charles in front of the remaining board members, "and you dropped it because you couldn't see past your own reflection." That very night, Charles submitted his resignation, though some said it was more of a forced removal. As for me, I didn't celebrate not in the way some might expect. There were no toasts, No grand speeches, just a quiet dinner in the hotel lounge, where I looked over the final signed documents and thought about the journey, the battle with cancer, the isolation, the erasure, and now the full circle moment where merit had finally spoken louder than ambition. It wasn't revenge I had wanted, it was recognition. And now, I finally had both. In the days that followed the signing of the Khalifa deal, the silence from Carson Myers was more deafening than any press release or statement could have been. News of their failure spread quietly but widely within the industry. Not because of scandal, but because of absence. They were no longer in the room when it mattered, and those who had once been proud to work under the Carson name now whispered of missed opportunities, leadership failures, and the danger of blind inheritance. Back at Grayfield, Allen called an emergency executive meeting to debrief the success and assess the fallout. When the team gathered, he made no effort to downplay what had happened. He credited the win to experience, discipline, and cultural intelligence not as buzzwords, but as values that had been quietly pushed aside by companies chasing appearances over depth. When he turned to me and thanked me publicly for salvaging the deal, it wasn't with applause or dramatic flair, it was with the quiet respect of someone who understood what it meant to survive, to persist, and to finally be heard. But justice wasn't finished writing its final chapter. A week later, Richard Carson, the once revered CEO who had unknowingly allowed rot to fester at the top of his company, addressed his remaining staff. He didn't sugarcoat what had happened. In front of the board and senior leadership, he looked Charles in the eye and said, "I took you in when no one else believed in you, and you repaid me by tearing down the foundation others spent decades building. You betrayed every value I once thought you understood." With those words, he handed Charles a choice: resign quietly or face public termination. There was no redemption left. Charles resigned on the spot, though he did so with the kind of quiet bitterness only a man stripped of unearned privilege could wear. He left the building that same afternoon, and by Monday, a memo circulated announcing a full restructuring of leadership protocols at Carson Myers. Yet the true justice wasn't in Charles's downfall, it was in what came after. In the months that followed, Carson Myers underwent a quiet transformation. Executives who had enabled Charles either stepped down or were reassigned, while new, blood-diverse, seasoned, and often in their 40s and 50s was brought in to restore balance and credibility. It was no longer about youthful disruption or empty ambition. It was about trust, humility, and rebuilding the culture from the ashes of arrogance. Back at Grayfield, Allen offered me the position of senior executive partner, a role that gave me oversight across departments, mentorship authority, and the freedom to shape our leadership development programs. I accepted not out of pride, but because I knew what kind of environment I wanted to help protect, one where people weren't judged by how old they looked or how long they'd been sick, but by what they knew, how they led, and whether they had the courage to stand for something when it was easier to stay quiet. And one afternoon, as we wrapped up a training session for new hires, Allen turned to me and asked the question that lingered on everyone's mind. "Why didn't you ever tell us you spoke 7 languages?" I smiled, leaned back, and replied, "Because in every job before this one, those languages were used to box me in, not to set me free. They saw translation, not negotiation. They saw support, not leadership. So this time, I let my work speak first and let the rest follow." He nodded, and that was the end of it. Now, I don't spend my days proving anything. I don't chase approval or try to outshine anyone. What I do is simpler. I build. I teach. I make room at the table for voices that were once silenced, just like mine had been. And every time someone over 50 walks through our door feeling like their best days are behind them, I show them otherwise. Because the truth is, some storms don't destroy you, they define you. If this story moved you, or if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or replaced too soon, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments. .tac. Subscribe for more true-to-life tales of resilience and redemption. .ta. Like if you believe dignity doesn't expire with age,